I just hope those pumpkins don't rot.
You going to be able to edit all this? If
Oh, yeah, we'll tweak it all together and pull of this and pull of that. Okay. Are we rolling? Sure. Okay. If you could just say your name and spell it for us, so if you could start.
Selma Goldstone, Goldstone.
Okay, and you, sir?
Edward Goldstone.
Okay, we can figure that out.
No, kidding.
Great. Okay. So what we're doing is kind of looking back at the history of Temple Beth. You've been involved with Temple for a good while, and so we're interested in your memories of Temple and how things have changed, but also your involvement in the community, kind of contributions you've made, organizations you've been part of, the cultural life, the social life, political, business. So it's looking at, because people who are active in Temple are usually active in life beyond Temple. So it's looking at, that whole richness that is always valuable information for the folks that come later on. So that's where we're engaged right now. That's what we're doing, and it's an archive that we've established and we've been working on now for close to a year. In terms preparation has been going on a good deal longer than that, but the actual taping was started about this time last year. So we're real happy that you're here and participating.
We're glad to be here. I think it's a wonderful idea.
So how far did you guys meet here in Temple? Where did you meet?
No.
No, we didn't meet in Temple.
Well,
We met, Selma was a counselor at Camp Nahelu, and I had two cousins who were also counselors, and their brother was taking a package, a care package, I guess, out to the camp. And he asked me if I'd like to go along, which I thought I'd do. It was in the evening, about 7 o'clock, and that's where I met Selma.
well, I was from New York, though. That would made it a little bit more difficult. And I was still in college. I guess I was a freshman when I first came here. And Edward was very gallant. He used to fly in on weekends. Kind of took me aback, so I had to get him to the point where he just came to visit, and we didn't go to theater, and we didn't go to dinner. And I don't think he really could have afforded all that anyway at that point. And then I had promised my folks that I would finish school, which I did in June, and we were married in August of 1942, 54 years ago. And unfortunately, the war had begun, and Edward was drafted, and we were married, not at home, but in Oklahoma. And
Lawton, Oklahoma.
Lawton, Oklahoma, where, believe it or not, we found relatives. Also former parts of Temple Beth, and they had migrated out west. And he was gone for 3.5 years, came home long enough to become part of the B-29 group that went over to bomb Japan. And we were very fortunate, and we've been grateful for that ever since. And now I think it's your turn.
Well, my family has been affiliated with Temple Bethel for well over 100 years. And my mother taught at Detroit Public Schools as well as at Bethel. And my grandfather was born in Prussia in 1842, and my grandmother was born in Toronto in 1850. My grandfather went to California, I guess, during the gold rush of 1849, and I don't know what all happened, but I think he bought a gold mine, and I don't think anything really came of it, and
We have a copy, if I may.
we do
and
have a copy.
Copy of the deed, which is worthless.
And he wound up in Idaho and then back to Michigan. My father was born in Howell, and my mother was born in Detroit. Somehow or other, the L. Black Company, which was down at Griswold and Grand River, became part of his activities and part of the family. But from that point on, I don't know what happened. My mother and father were married at Temple Beth, the old temple down on Woodward and Elliott, which later became the Bonstell Playhouse. They were married November the 5th, 1906, by Rabbi Franklin. And we have a lot of books at home. We have one by Isaac M. Weiss. I think I have it with me, if you would like to see it. This book was called The Divine Service for the New Year by Isaac M. Weiss, and it was printed in 1866. The book is printed in English, in Hebrew, and in German. Very interesting.
What is your earliest memories of Temple Beth?
Well, I lived in an apartment on Wilson and Seward. Wilson later became Woodrow Wilson, and we would go to Temple on Sunday morning. We would walk to 12th Street. There was a car line, and take the car, and we'd go down to Temple, and we would congregate in the main sanctuary, the children as well as the adults. And the children would stay in the sanctuary until it was time for the sermon. Then they would go up to the classroom. And Rabbi Franklin, there's one little thing that I've never forgotten. He came in, went up to the pulpit, said, "Good morning, children," and he said, "I have an announcement to make." He said, "Today I am 1 year old." He said, "You know, there are 52 weeks in the year," and he says, "Today I am 52." And it was a bit of humor, and all the kids thought it was great.
Now, how about your first experience at Temple Beth?
Well,
Here's this college girl from New York coming in
to the
from big
hinterland.
city to rural Detroit. What was it like for you?
Well, my mother, I think, really thought I was coming to rural mid-America, and came with me when I first came here to meet the family. And those were the days when girls were chaperoned, and she approved. And it was a very warm reception that I received. And I think one of the first things we did was come to Temple. And the family always sat on the right side of the sanctuary, never deviated. And when I questioned it, I was told that that's where the pews used to be. And in each generation, that was discontinued. We still sit on the right side. And I felt I was confirmed at a place called Jewish Science, which nobody has heard of, or very few persons have. And it was akin to Christian Science, except that they believed in medical care. And I had very little Jewish tradition in my background. And so when I came to Temple, I was delighted I could understand everything, and it became very meaningful to me. And we always went as a family, so that it was very comforting kind of experience, and rather formal. I mean, everybody dressed, not overdressed, but dressed properly, and it was a big excursion. And then, after the war, we lived here for 2 years, was it?
Here.
And then we were transferred back to New Jersey for 5 years. But we would come back frequently. And when we moved here permanently, after which we had 3 children, I became active in Temple, in the sisterhood, worked in the gift shop. And in subsequent years, I worked with Miriam Kushner upstairs in the archives for years. So you can see that this is really the kind of thing I am very enthusiastic about. I think Temple has long been in need. We would be able to answer many more of your questions had this been done 50 or 75 years ago. And I've always felt a great warmth, but I must admit that the new era at Temple has created an amazing renaissance, and I am delighted to see that. And so the new generation is taking over with great enthusiasm, and we still are active. I'm on some of the committees, like the Worship and Ritual Committee. I was active in the survey committee that we had several years ago. Somehow I've always sort of kept my finger in the pie. And
Now, you've been active in Temple. What about outside in the community at large? We're talking about B-29s, and that brings up, like pilots and navigators and bombardiers and all. Were you an Air Force guy, or?
I was in the Air Force. I was originally over in England, and I was in a B-24 bomb group, and I was brought back to the United States after about 19 months in preparation for the B-29 plane going over to the Pacific. We lived in a little town in Nebraska, McCook, Nebraska, and we lived on a farm because it was the only place we could find to live. And the one thing that was very interesting, for the holidays, well, let me say this: we lived with these people who owned the farm. They didn't do the farming. Mr. Ingalls had a tenant farmer. He worked for the Burlington Railroad, and he would drive in every morning and come back at night. And they were concerned that we had nobody to share the holidays with. And they introduced us to a man and his wife, and his name was Goldansky, Mr. Goldansky, who used to be the engineer on the original Denver Zephyr. Now the Zephyr, this was back in 1935, used to leave Chicago and go to Denver. And he took the train out of Chicago, apparently, and I don't know where he stopped. But nevertheless, he lived in McCook. And he was in his late 70s, I think, when we met him.
Yeah.
But he was called back to the railroad, to the Burlington, because they had no engineers. And he would take the train, I don't know how many times a week, from McCook to halfway between McCook and Denver, which was a total of 250 miles. He'd take it about 125 miles, and then he would pick it up on the return and bring it back to McCook. And it was a very interesting thing.
And I think they were as glad to find us as we were to find them, because it was such a small community, and they were wonderful to us. In fact, everybody was there. I learned how to collect eggs, which I would take in to sell for 27 cents a dozen, because the Ingalls had an only child who was a son who was in the Marines. And because we were staying at their home, they were able to go to Camp Pendleton to say goodbye to him. He went to Iwo Jima. But he came home, so that was good. So, I don't know why I feel cheery, but I do. Forgive me.
You're going back a ways. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they're lively, vibrant memories. Exciting things.
Well, they were difficult times, but I think when you're young, you have lots of faith. And I think our parents were wonderful and supportive. And I often remember that. It was, many ways, we were so fortunate, because Edward didn't tell you that he was in Libya and he was in part of the Ploesti raids. And he came home in one piece.
And then I went over to the Pacific, wound up on the island of Tinian, which is in the Marianas. And the bombing of Tokyo and Japan was carried out from Guam, Tinian, Saipan, so on. And I was there the morning of the bombing of Hiroshima. And I'll never forget, I was listening, I was in radio, and I'm listening to the radio that morning, and I heard President Truman make the announcement that this bomb had the power of the sun and everything else, and that the area was uninhabitable for 80 years, he mentioned. And we knew something was going on before that, because we had heard that England had a super bomb. It was great big bomb. It had nothing to do with the atomic bomb. And that was the only thing that we had heard. And we thought that the planes that were being brought over, the squadron that was coming over for this mission, would have the modifications to hold this bomb. But when they arrived, we looked and there was no change. And the only change that I noticed was a liaison transmitter, another one, and that was it. And the Enola Gay took off the morning of, probably on the 5th of August, and dropped the bomb on the 6th of August, which happened to be Selma's birthday.
We don't celebrate that way anymore.
No.
In Detroit, you talked about coming back here from New Jersey, and sounds like probably in the early 50s.
53.
What was it like in Detroit in 1953, and what was happening in Temple Beth?
Well, was Rabbi Glazer still here? I think he had just passed
left,
away.
and Rabbi Hertz
Rabbi Hertz
was here. But one thing I forgot to mention before, there's a picture of my uncle. the confirmation class of 1893, and it's in the north corridor of the temple here. There were 7 children in the confirmation class. There were 6 boys and 1 girl. And who was it? Rabbi Grossman.
Yes.
And there isn't one of my father or my mother, but they were confirmed, obviously. And I was confirmed in the old temple on Woodward and Gladstone in 1925. And there were about 89 children in the confirmation class. That was some time ago. But the temple was relatively new. I think that it was opened in 1922 or 23.
And in those days, and even when our children were confirmed here, the parties that were given were very simple teas at home. And it was charming because you would go from friends to friends home, and it was quite different from what has evolved.
So, in the 50s then, coming back to Detroit, and it was post-war and pretty much a boom town. I mean,
Yeah.
things were going absolutely nuts in Detroit with the auto industry, and the unions were getting these huge. What was it like for you coming back?
Well, it was great. We had streetcars that worked and were reliable, and I can remember taking our youngsters down to Hudson's for lunch, and our daughters wore little white gloves and carried little purses and wore hats. And sometimes we'd go to a place called Frames, which was a block or 2 away from Hudson's, and it was a wonderful tea room type restaurant, and it was a big adventure. People were very courteous, and it was a much gentler time. We weren't afraid of anything. You didn't lock your house, and the children played outside, and you knew all of your neighbors, and you helped one another. And of course, we were young and struggling to make our way, and I can remember one time, right after one of our cousins, who were members of Temple too, came over, and they brought a bag of donuts. And we were so excited because they could afford the bag of donuts. I spent a lot of time with the family. We had a maiden aunt whose name was Louise Goldstone. And after Edward's mother passed away in 1940, she and his Uncle Mark, the one whose portrait is on the wall, moved in together with his dad. And she sort of ran the house. She had worked for many, many years at the
United Jewish Charities.
at the clinic,
The
West
clinic.
End Clinic.
Yeah.
And it was sad because she really wanted to study nursing. And when she was a girl, that was not an accepted vocation for a young Jewish girl. And so she spent her time volunteering, and as she got older, she began to work for some of the doctors in the community. And we had dinner together every Sunday, promptly at 5 o'clock. And I can remember Edward's dad, who had his own carving set. It is really beautiful. Of course, we still have it, and it will go to our son. But on the hottest day of the summer, Dad would stand there with a starched white shirt and a blue serge suit and carve and serve dinner. And we were never to be late. And we never were.
No, that's true.
And that was another family ritual. once a week they went to the Fisher Theater en masse. But the funniest thing was, once you arrived within the theater proper, they all dispersed. Everybody sat someplace else. It was never
They all had their favorite
Yeah.
seats, I guess.
just like a temple where people have their favorite seats. But they were very protective and very loving. And when Aunt Louise became quite ill, our children were still quite young. I spent a lot of time volunteering at what was then the Jewish old folks home down on Petoskey. And I found it easiest to be with her and other folks doing occupational therapy, which was very, very fulfilling for me, and I hope for her. And she died there. And see, her dad died in
1958.
1958. And then we were on our own because Edward was an only child. And we don't have much family at all. But we have wonderful friends, and
Great
it's been
children.
a good life. And I've belonged to all the traditional Jewish organizations, Hadassah, Council. Oh, what else? I can't even think. But never as active in them as I was here at Temple or at the old folks' home.
Active in Temple, what about the community at large?
Well, I rang doorbells for schools in Royal Oak where our children went to school. We live in Huntington Woods. And I was always active in the PTA. We both were active in PTA and room mother and so forth. So many of those memories are dormant, and I admit I was focusing more on temple memories there than I was in communal activities, though you asked that in your letter.
We talk about the Fisher Theater. Are you theater-going folks or symphony
Yes,
folks or
yes.
CIA or what
We
kind of?
belonged to the symphony.
For many, many years.
I started going to Carnegie Hall when I was a child with my mother, and the theater and the museums. She was determined. I can remember Eva Le Gallienne and Peter Pan as a child. I can recall going to the Metropolitan Opera House, which was not where it is today, in New York City, and spending hours at the Metropolitan Museum. Of course, we belong to the DIA. We've always enjoyed the arts, and I think they're a very full part of our, very
Oh, absolutely.
active part of our lives. And now we go to Hillberry and
Stagecrafters in Royal Oak.
and the Jet, and of course, occasionally to some of the other big productions that come to town. We missed the opera when it stopped coming, the Metropolitan, I mean. We haven't been down to the new opera house. We hope to go. And we live a very full and active life. We're very, very fortunate. And our only misfortune is that our children don't live that close. We have one in California, and one in Birmingham, Alabama, and I forgot. I didn't forget, but we have one also in Milford. But that's not close enough for me. So.
Did you have anything you wanted to ask?
Oh,
And you would still talk that.
okay.
Oh,
Okay, yeah, I realize that. Well, Edward had a very, very severe and critical heart attack 9 years ago. And we had taken one big trip a year ever since 1960. And we could no longer go abroad because he took ill in Victoria, Canada, which was a dreadful experience on one hand and a wonderful experience on the other hand, because I found myself enmeshed in a group of people who were so loving and so caring that it was an all-time lesson for both of us and our family. They just took me in with open arms, and we're still in touch with them. And when we came back, we discovered that it took a long time for Edward to recuperate, that we still missed so much of what we had been familiar with and so enjoyed. And we heard about the elder hostel movement, which is for people of over 55. I'm sure you know about it. And it's international. But we couldn't subject ourselves to anything that glorious. And so we went to a couple here in Michigan, just to feel it out, just to see what it was about and to see whether we enjoyed it. And one was at Spring Arbor College outside of Jackson, and one was up at Central Michigan University. And both of them were so rewarding. We enjoyed the academic side, and we enjoyed the social side and the kinds of people who were involved. They were everything from ex-college professors to just ordinary laymen. But everybody was enthusiastic and interested and wanted to go on living and learning. And then we had the opportunity here in our area to be part of a group that formed its own division affiliated with Elder Hostel, and that was called the Adult Learning Institute. And we started with 35 people, and it has now grown so large. They meet at the Orchard Ridge campus of OCC almost daily. They're a wonderful, wonderful group. And I think it's closed as to admissions now because they have so many people. And of course, what I'm trying to indicate is that the need among older adults is so vast. And we just have to find the room and the sponsor, which is not easy. However, Edward and I now are going out to some classes, and that too is part of an elder hostel affiliation out in Ann Arbor. And we meet at the Kellogg Center. They are very kind. They have a beautiful auditorium, and they have allowed this particular group to partake of what they have to offer, in addition to a cafeteria. And the Detroit Edison Company is so generous. There was some sort of facility with a huge parking lot that they have in Ann Arbor, and they open it to us so that we can park in Ann Arbor. And so we are continuing to learn, and we encourage anybody who ever mentions Elder Hostel to partake. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And as I said, it's international. We have friends who have gone all over the world with them. And it's moderate in price, so that's an important feature.
Anything else?
Oh, gee.
When we were in McCook, there was no way that we could participate in the holiday. I know. No, that was
just being with another Jewish, just being with some other Jewish people. And I think Mrs. Goldansky Yes, she did. She made a Passover dinner, I think, for us. And I remember taking the train to Denver, and we brought back corned beef for everybody and rye bread. Remember that?
Sure, I remember that.
I hadn't thought about that until this moment. As far as our personal holidays, truthfully, you might not want to include this, a good part of Edward's family were not Jewish. And we were all very, very close. And every year at Christmas time, we had the largest house. And so everybody came, not necessarily to celebrate Christmas as a religious holiday, but as a family get-together. And then in your family, you had never celebrated Passover.
No.
And in my family, my parents didn't, but we went to a cousin's. So I knew what Passover was. In addition to which, my cousin Miriam Fierce's father was the chief rabbi of Montreal. And I have an exquisite picture of him coming to Mount Vernon, New York, to celebrate the Passover with his family. And we have this photo of him in a white robe and very patriarchal looking. And so that was my childhood memory. I mean, we did that every year. So when our children were small, I felt that we ought to get back to some of the tradition. And that tradition has lasted to this day. I have Passover every year. The kids who are here, the kids who are in town, and we always ask people who are alone or people who are not Jewish to share our Passover celebration. And I admit, being old-fashioned, we still use the old prayer book from Temple for the Passover service. No, we have new ones now. But it's a very warm and loving time in which we share not only foods, but good spirits, and tell the story of Passover. And I think our grandchildren have continued that tradition, except in one family where there was an intermarriage, and the children were not brought up with any religion at all. And but they always like to come to Passover, and they always like to find the Afikomen. And the eldest will be 21, and she still looks for the Afikomen. So as far as the other traditions, we always try to have people for Rosh Hashanah, mainly those who are alone. We unfortunately have widowed friends now, or divorced friends. And we're generally invited out for the break fast. But if not, glad to have it at home. And those are the most important holidays, I think, that we celebrate.
Right.
I might say that when we lived in Westfield, New Jersey, it's a very small world. There were 15 of us, and we built a beautiful temple in Westfield, New Jersey. And Edward built the first sukkah
Sukkah, yeah. Right.
for them.
For the,
And before the temple was completed, we went to services in Rahway, New Jersey. And guess who the rabbi was?
no, it was
Plainfield, New Jersey. The rabbi was Rabbi Danny Syme's dad. And that was a long time ago. And he was filling in, I think, for another rabbi who was still in service. And then they went on to Pennsylvania. So it has come full circle. Yes,
Yeah.
you're right.
Yeah.
Mhm. We were made honorary members, lifetime members.
Lifetime members.
I think on the 25th anniversary, wasn't it?
Of the
the
temple.
temple. And in those, when we started it, there were very few Jewish people in Plainfield. They were mostly,
Westfield.
Westfield, mostly the shopkeepers, and we met in a church. And it was this small town, very much like Birmingham was 20 years ago. And it was a nice place to live, good schools. Oh, you asked about Detroit, what it was like. One of the reasons we moved to Huntington Woods when we came back, we had left a superb school system. Our eldest child was 8 years old, and our youngest was 2. And 2 of our cousins here in Detroit were school teachers, and one was a principal. And they, at that time, had Quonset huts for classrooms in Detroit. And they suggested that we not move to Detroit because the schools were not as good at that point in 1953 as they were in some of the suburbs. And that's why we chose Royal Oak, because the Royal Oak school system, because their school system was so good. But it still was not on a par with what we had had in the East. And then, of course, Huntington Woods switched over to Berkeley, and I think upgraded the school system. You're bringing out a lot of dormant memories.
Well, you talked about those trolley cars, and I went to the church at Central Woodward.
Oh, yeah.
In Taylor, and so I remember them interrupting services. So,
Do you really?
and that lunch at Hudson's. I
Yeah.
used to do those with my
And remember the Hudson Christmas? Of course you do. The windows and the beautiful displays, and the officer who would conduct or control traffic with a microphone, and heaven help you if you put your foot down and crossed against the light. You would say that lady in the beige coat.
And the mounted police were down there for the pedestrians to cross the street.
I have a story to tell you that Edward really doesn't want me to tell, but I'm going to anyway, and I hope that he will forgive me. During the war, in the Fisher Building, there was a beautiful restaurant called Leglon's. And Edward's aunt took me to lunch there one day. And along came Rabbi Franklin. And he was absolutely charming and delightful. And when Aunt Trixie introduced me to him, I had never met him. He said, "Oh my goodness, Edward, summa cum laude." And I was so impressed. I thought, how could he possibly remember that? But that's the kind of man he was. He knew his congregants. And that has stuck in my mind. And I'm glad to have told it to you.
Anything else, Peggy?
Talk about leaving a legacy. What do you think the legacy that you would like to remember is most of all? Here at the temple, with your family, with your children, a permanent memory. What comes to your mind when I draw up the word legacy?
Do you want me to respond to that? Or? The word that comes to my mind is love. I think our legacy is that, my legacy, is that I've tried with all my heart to be the kind of person who is a good parent. No, I will change that. I think a person who is a good spouse, someone who was a loving parent. I might add loving spouse, who feels a sense of family unity and family strength, and who wants to hand down family traditions And I think we worked at that, and I think our children are interested. Our daughter, for instance, who lives in Milford, called early this morning from school, where she teaches in the high school, telling us how excited she was that we were going to be doing this today. And our children are all interested in the family heritage, I think a little bit proud of it. And on my side, too. I mean, I'm not going into my own family because, of course, it's Temple Beth. But I feel that my parents left me a wonderful legacy. And I hope I can live up to it.
Is there something that you would like to add to that?
I don't think there's anything I can add to that. Selma said it so beautifully. I don't think there's anything.
Well,
Really.
I think you have to give an awful lot. Marriage is something that there are lots of pains and lots of heartaches. But there's a lot of strengths, too. And we've been very, very lucky. And we know it. And we are with our children and their spouses and our grandchildren. We've gotten into computers, and it's wonderful with the little ones, little ones. We have 3 in college now, but they email us and tell us all their thoughts and ideas and woes. And
There's a closeness that we have with them now that we never would have had,
no,
even on the telephone. We write almost every day. They write too. And in spite of this, we talk to them for at least an hour or so on Sundays. And you'd never imagine how much there is to say. When you do it every day, it's like a diary.
well, you write some little brain teasers,
Yeah,
too.
well, it's a fun thing.
Yeah, it is fun. First thing we do in the morning is put the computer on to see whether there are any messages. And try not to go to bed at night without having answered them. So modern times are wonderful. But I miss the more gentle times. Maybe it's because I'm old. No, I'm not old. I
Not
guess
old.
not inside. But when you came up and greeted us so warmly today, and that impressed me. It really did, because it doesn't happen very often anymore. And I thank you for that, because it made this interview a lot easier.